been working our way through the Hebrew scriptures, looking at each book in terms of a basic overview. We are now on the book of Lamentations. And the first word of Lamentations is Echa. This is where we get the title for the book. But then as far as English, let me just go to the Septuagint a moment. The Septuagint has thenoi, meaning lamentations. This comes from the Greek verb thraamai, meaning to cry aloud or to lament. In the Latin, the title is threni, meaning tears, with the interpretation, the Lamentations of Yirmiyahu or Jeremiah. Hence, the English title is derived from the Latin. The author. While there is no mention of Jeremian authorship of the Hebrew text of the book of Lamentations, it is best, I believe, to understand Jeremiah as the author for the following reasons. First of all, strong tradition from the Septuagint to the 3rd century affirm Jeremian authorship. For example, the Septuagint begins this book with the statement, "It came to pass that after Israel was taken captive and Jerusalem was made desolate, Jeremiah sat weeping and lamented with this lamentation over Jerusalem." The tradition has been followed by many of the church, many good versions and commentators down past the early church fathers into the present time. Also, 2 Chronicles 35:25 says that Jeremiah is distinctly associated with the lamentation type of literature. And then, finally, the internal evidence of the book tends to be Jeremian authorship and composition. The scenes were given by an eyewitness, of which Jeremiah fully qualifies. And when comparing the two books, Jeremiah and Lamentations, there is unmistakable similarities. For example, both writings, we see national calamities and the same causes. And the characteristic phrase, daughter of, occurs in each book about 20 times. Furthermore, the prophet's weeping, his tears, as he appeals for aid to God, the righteous judge, and his expectation that eventually Jerusalem's enemies will be judged, all are manifestly prominent in both books. As to the date, Jeremiah probably wrote the book immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. In terms of the historical background, the background for this book is none other than the desolation that came to the city of Jerusalem when she was captured by the Babylonian army around 586 BC. The city after this conquest is now barren and destroyed. The prophet writes concerning the sorrow over it on the basis of 2 Chronicles 35:25. Some have tried to make the historical background not the Babylonian conquest at all, but the death of Josiah. In refuting this view, Raven clearly says, a careful reading of the book shows that it is not at all appropriate as a dirge for Josiah. It is hardly conceivable that the chronicler could have been so ignorant of the contents of this canonical book. The book of Lamentations, in which he referred, was totally distinct from the one before us. Apparently, it contained the lamentations of the singing men and women, as well as those of Jeremiah, and may have been an extensive collection of dirges for use at funerals. As to the purpose of the book is to express the sorrow of the prophet's heart over the desolation of the city of Jerusalem and over the destruction of the theocracy that was in Jerusalem. Because of sin and rebellion on the part of God's people at this time, the Lord has judged the city, and outside evil forces have plundered it. The writer deeply laments over the iniquity of the people and its results, and calls upon the people to repent. He also speaks for the punishment of those who destroyed the holy city. In summarizing then the nature of this book, Edward J. Young writes as follows. This is one of the most tragic books in the Bible. The nation from whom salvation was to come has become so filthy that God would destroy her outward theocratic form. Against the background of this fact, we may understand the cry, how does the city sit solitary, that was full of people, how is she become as a widow? She that was great among the nations and princes among the provinces, how is she become tributary? Although the book is one of sadness, in the midst of the poet's despair, hope shines forth, as there is an appeal to the Lord's mercy. The real fulfillment of this hope for Israel is yet future, when Messiah shall reign triumphantly in that new Jerusalem. The argument, or the flow of thought. The theme of the book of Lamentations is lament over the desolation of Jerusalem. The book of Lamentations presents the mourning of the prophet Jeremiah over the fallen city of Jerusalem. In chapter 2, the prophet describes the desolation that resulted from the Lord's punishment on the city and its ruin, giving the reason for her judgment and as to why the Lord allowed this to happen. The prophet then identifies himself with the chastened people and cries with them over Jerusalem's condition in chapter 3. His sorrows with them over the judgment, exhortations to them to repent and be in submission to God. And then there is a prayer for the vindication of Zion's enemies. Following the prophet's cry over the city, he recounts the horrors of the siege and the fall of Jerusalem in chapter 4. The gold and stones of the people have been desecrated. Terrible famine conditions stalk the city, and violence is seen everywhere. The chapter closes then with a prediction of Edom's coming punishment and judgment. Finally, the book concludes in chapter 5 with a petition for Jerusalem's restoration. Jerusalem's case is stated in chapter 5, and there is a petition made by the faithful remnant for restoration to their former estate. So this is the quick review of the background to the book of Lamentations. To give a brief summary outline, in chapter 1, we have the description of Jerusalem's ruin. In chapter 2, the cause of Jerusalem's ruin. In chapter 3, the cry over the city's ruin. And then in chapter 4, the description of the horrors of the Jerusalem siege and fall under Babylon. And then finally, the petition of the Lord for a final restoration someday. So that's in essence a brief summary of the flow of thought of the overall background to the book of Lamentations. And one is reminded in the New Testament of how Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem and says, if you had just known this your day, in speaking of his advent and his coming. And so it's interesting. We have this theme. We have it very early on of lamentation over the destruction of Ur in Sumerian literature. And so it's a theme that is in the ancient Near Eastern literature as well, lamentation. And I think that what we learn from a book like this is that we need to try to be faithful to the Lord and to love him, to serve him, and be faithful. I think that is the challenge that we would find as we look at the New Testament and as we look at a text like this, looking at the lamentation that went on by Jeremiah over the downfall of Jerusalem under the Babylonians who came in and destroyed the city at that time.